What is life like for a Roman soldier stationed on Hadrian's Wall? Let's find out. On the desolate stretch of Hadrian's Wall in northern England, nestled between two watchtowers, stands a fort that served as a home to 150 soldiers during the 2nd century AD. Now, modern archaeologists have reconstructed a section of this fort, which has given us an idea of how these soldiers lived while guarding the wall. But does it really give us the full picture? Could there be more to life on the wall than just rain, mud, and boredom? Hadrian's Wall was constructed by the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD. This defensive structure stretched across the northern part of the province of Britannia, where the modern-day countries of England and Scotland meet, and it was manned by the Roman army, who were tasked with keeping the unruly northern tribes out of Roman territory. One of the most important parts of the wall was the forts that dotted its length. These forts were not only used as bases for the soldiers stationed on the wall, but they were also used to house civilians who worked in support roles, such as supplying the army with food and other necessities. The fort we are talking about today is called Hadrian's Roman Fort. It was first excavated in the 19th century, and later reconstructed by the 1930s. It is now open to the public as a museum. But what was everyday life like for a soldier stationed here? Life on the wall was tough. Not only did the soldiers have to deal with the harsh weather conditions, but they also had to contend with the lack of entertainment and the constant threat of danger from the tribes that lived beyond the wall. The reconstruction of Hadrian's Roman Fort gives us a glimpse into this way of life. It shows us the barracks where the soldiers slept, the latrines where they relieved themselves, and the bathhouse where they could relax after a long day of work. It also gives us an idea of the rations they ate and the weapons they used. But it doesn't tell us much about the boredom that would have set in after months or even years of living in such a desolate place. Let us take a look at the fort and see if we can fill in some of these blanks. As we walk through the reconstructed fort, we can get a sense of the daily routine that the soldiers would have followed. The fort was divided into two main areas, the civilian area and the military area. The civilian area consisted of the civilian houses, shops, and other buildings that housed the people who worked on the fort. The military area consisted of the barracks, training yard, and other buildings that were used by the soldiers. We start our tours in the civilian area and visit the bakery. Here we can imagine the smell of fresh bread wafting through the air as the baker kneads dough and prepares meals for the fort's inhabitants. Moving on, we come across a blacksmith shop where the soldiers could get their weapons sharpened or repaired. The rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil echoes through the fort, as the blacksmith works tirelessly to keep the soldiers' equipment in top condition. Further along, we encounter a civilian house. These houses were typically small and cramped, with one room for the family to live in, and a separate room for the family's business. The walls were made of stone and the roof was made of thatch or wood. Furniture was minimal and consisted of things like stools, tables, and beds made of wood. The rooms were shared by the whole family, including any servants or slaves that they might have owned. Life for the civilians on the wall was not easy. They were constantly at risk of being attacked by the Picts or other northern tribes, and they had to live in close quarters with the soldiers, who were often loud and unruly. However, the civilians were an integral part of the fort and provided the soldiers with the supplies they needed to keep the wall strong. We now move on to the military section of the fort, which was where the soldiers lived and worked. The barracks were typically large, rectangular buildings made of stone with wooden roofs. They were divided into multiple rooms, each housing several soldiers. The rooms were dark and dank with little ventilation, making them uncomfortable places to live. Despite the discomfort, the soldiers were expected to keep their barracks clean and orderly. The walls were adorned with graffiti and paintings, which gave the soldiers a chance to express themselves and make their living quarters feel more like home. In the training yard, we can imagine the soldiers practicing their fighting skills with wooden swords and shields. The air is filled with the sounds of clashing weapons as they prepare to defend the wall against any invaders. The training yard was also used for other activities such as drills and exercises to keep the soldiers fit and ready for action. One of the most dreaded parts of life on the wall was the latrines. These were the public bathrooms that the soldiers and civilians used. They were located near the barracks and were simply holes dug into the ground with wooden platforms above them. There was no privacy, and the toilets were often filled with waste and insects, making them an unpleasant place to visit. However, they were necessary for public health and sanitation, and the people on the wall had no other choice but to use them. While we know about the defeat of the three sisters, we do not know who they were or why they chose to rebel against Rome. We can fill in some of these blanks by looking at history. This is the story of Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, and her rebellion against the Roman Empire. Let's get into it. Boudica was queen of the Iceni tribe, which was located in what is today Norfolk and Suffolk, England. Her husband, Prasutagus, had been a client king of Rome. Basically, he did the bidding of Rome in exchange for their protection. When Prasutagus died, he left his kingdom to his two daughters in Rome. Well, Rome wasn't having that. They wanted all of his stuff. Now, they probably would have gotten away with it if it weren't for Boudica. She was pissed. And if there's one thing we've learned about women throughout history, it's that when you piss a woman off, you should run, because when they come after you, they come correct. She was so pissed that she assembled an army and marched on the Roman city of Camulodunum, which is today Colchester. She didn't just want her land back, oh no, she wanted revenge, and she got it. Boudicca's forces slaughtered the Romans in this city. Men, women, children, none were spared. Boudicca set fire to the city and it burned to the ground. Then she moved on to Londinium, which is today London. This city fared no better than the last one. Boudicca set fire to it as well and killed anyone who didn't run away. Finally, she laid siege to Verulamium, which is today St. Albans. This was another prosperous Roman city, but it was destined to meet the same fate as the other two. But before the massacre could begin, Boudicca's forces were met by Roman legions. The Romans forced them to flee, ending the siege and the rebellion. But the story doesn't end here, because there are different versions of what happened next. Some sources claim that Boudicca took her own life rather than surrender to the Romans, but other sources claim that she was executed by the Romans. We don't know which version is true, but I think both are equally fitting for such a badass queen. Let's talk about the dates of this rebellion. That's important because it's the only known time a British queen led her people to war against the Romans. And we know the years because the Roman governor at the time, Suetonius Paulinus, wrote about it in a letter to the emperor, Nero. He said that the rebellion began in the year 60 AD. This makes sense because Boudicca's husband had died around that time, so it would have been pretty fresh on her mind. Now, there are some historians who claim that the rebellion actually happened in 43 AD. That's right after the Romans had invaded Britain. This argument is based on the fact that the Romans wouldn't have been able to raise an army in Britain yet. So it would make more sense if Boudicca rebelled right away instead of waiting until 60. There's no way of knowing for sure. So we'll just have to agree to disagree on this one. What is agreed upon, though, is that the rebellion lasted only 3 years. By 63 AD, the Romans had crushed all opposition and the Britons were back under their thumb. Next, let's talk about how the Romans viewed Boudicca. In their eyes, she was a savage. A female warrior queen just didn't fit in with Roman ideas about gender roles. They couldn't believe that she would dare lead her people to war, especially against Rome. This is the reason why the Romans tried so hard to erase all records of her from history. If the Romans were able to control the narrative, then they could claim that the rebellion was a small-scale riot, nothing more than a bunch of angry peasants throwing rocks at the glorious Roman Empire. And if you can call it that, the truth is that Boudicca was a force to be reckoned with, and the Romans knew it. That's why they wrote stories about her. One story claimed that she had killed her husband and that's why she was so bent on getting revenge. Another story claimed that she was a spy for the Gauls. This was Rome's way of saying that she was a foreign agent. These stories didn't catch on though. It was obvious to most people that the Romans were just trying to tarnish Boudicca's name, so they didn't pay much attention to these stories. Now, it's important to remember that most Britons were illiterate, so the Romans weren't exactly spreading their propaganda to a wide audience. But the few Britons who could read would have heard about Boudicca's supposed crimes, and they would have passed it on to the other Britons through word of mouth. So even though the Romans tried to erase Boudicca from history, they actually did the opposite. They made her a legend. Okay, now let's talk about the strength of Boudicca's army. Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, wrote that he had defeated an army of 100,000 warriors. That's a pretty big number, but most historians agree that it's an exaggeration. The biggest problem with this number is that there weren't 100,000. What's the best thing to preserve from an ancient city? If you said writing tablets made of wood, well, then you are right. You are so very right. Hi, it's me and this is my channel. This is the Roman fort of Vindolanda in northern England. And over the years, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of these wooden writing tablets here. These tablets were written on with a stylus and ink, and they document everything from the movement of troops to the price of grain. We can learn so much about how the Romans lived, worked and played by studying these. But what if we could find something even more personal from their everyday lives? Something like, I don't know, a shoe. Well, we are in luck because archaeologists also found a lot of shoes here too. Vindolanda was a frontier fort built in the 2nd century AD along the edge of the Great Empire, a place where the wild northern tribes occasionally gave the Romans a hard time. So it's not surprising that there was a fort here at all. What is surprising is just how much stuff they found here. Archaeologists have been excavating the site since 1969, and they've found the remains of barracks, shops, workshops, a bathhouse, even a shrine. They've also found a lot of shoes. When archaeologists first started digging here, they expected to find just a few coins and maybe a brooch or two. Instead, they found over 2,000 objects made of leather. There were shoes, sandals, pouches, belts, and even gloves. It's the largest collection of Roman leatherwork ever found outside of Italy. And it's not just a big pile of stuff in the corner somewhere. Every item has been carefully preserved in the muddy ground, so they're in excellent condition. So why did they find so many shoes here? Well, the answer might be a little disappointing. We already talked about how Vindolanda was a frontier fort, a place where soldiers were stationed as they defended the empire from those pesky northern tribes. But the people stationed here weren't just soldiers. They were also civilian workers who built and repaired the fort, merchants who sold goods and services, farmers who grew food, and even prostitutes who entertained the soldiers. All of these people needed shoes, and when their shoes wore out, they threw them away. And because the soil here is so acidic, those shoes survived for almost 2,000 years. Most of the shoes found at Vindolanda are pretty ordinary. They're simple sandals made of leather thongs and nailed to a sole. But some of them are pretty fancy too. There are bronze shoes with decorative buckles and even a pair of high-heel sandals. The Romans invented high heels. You know, whoever said that was a modern invention was clearly a liar. The archaeologists haven't just been looking at the shoes themselves though. They've been analyzing the dirt under the nails and the imprints left in the leather. This kind of analysis is called zooarchaeology, and it tells us what animals the people here were eating and wearing. Most of the leather shoes found at Vindolanda are made of cowhide, but there's also sheep, pigskin, and even horse. And the closer archaeologists look, the more they learn. One shoe even had a small piece of gristle still attached to it, and they were able to identify that as the remains of a sheep's knuckle. So not only does this tell us that sheep were on the menu in Roman times, but it also shows us that these people were unsqueamish about using every part of an animal that was given to them. Shoes are such a personal item, so finding so many of them here gives us a real glimpse into the lives of the people who lived here almost 2,000 years ago. They're a reminder that behind every big historical event, there are countless stories of ordinary people just trying to get through their day. We can be thankful that when we read about the lives of wealthy Romans today, we are reading about people who enjoyed the finer things in life. The wealthy Romans enjoyed chariots, slaves, villas, and baths. And today we are going to talk about these baths. We know about Roman baths from a number of sources, including archaeology and literature. There has been quite a bit written about Roman bathing practices and how they differed from Greek bathing practices. But what about the baths of the rich and powerful? How did their baths differ from the public baths? Were they more luxurious? Did they have slaves to serve them? Today we are going to take a peek into the baths of a Roman governor and find out just how much bathing the Romans liked. Baths were popular amongst the Romans and even more so amongst the Greeks before them. It was not only a place for cleansing oneself, but also a place to socialize and conduct business. Bathing was seen as an important part of daily life, and everyone from emperors to slaves would bathe regularly. For the rich and powerful, bathing could be a way to relax and unwind after a long day of running the province. They could also use their baths to entertain guests or even hold court. Archaeological evidence shows that the richest people in Rome had access to their own private baths within their homes. These private baths were much more luxurious than the public baths and were often used by wealthy Romans as a way to relax and socialize. Private baths were often decorated with marble and gold and were furnished with couches and chairs. Some private baths even had underfloor heating. In addition to the bathing facilities, the wealthy Romans might also have had access to other luxuries such as saunas and massage rooms. This is all according to Cassius Dio's Roman history. He says that Nero's private bath had many wonderful things in it. Some were beautiful marble statues and others were golden. A wonderful couch was placed between the warm and cold baths, where a crown of laurel branches had been set up previously for Nero to put on. The walls were covered in paintings that depicted scenes from Greek mythology, so it seems that, like many emperors, Nero spent a lot of time in his baths. The story goes that Caligula once surprised his wife while she was bathing, and she tried to hide her nakedness behind a golden shield. He got really angry about this and shouted, "What am I, a barbarian, that I want to see your body painted gold?" He said that he wanted to see if she was as beautiful without paint as she was with it. She ended up telling him to get lost, so he left her alone in the bathroom. It seems that the emperor was pretty turned off by this whole situation, because he never touched her again. Instead, he had a portrait of her made and hung it up in the bathroom, telling everyone that it was the most beautiful woman in the world. A great example of a villa with amazing baths was the Villa of the Quintili, which was built at the end of the 1st century AD and discovered in 1909 near the modern town of Nemi, Italy. The frescoes from the peristyle indicate that the building was occupied around 138. During the excavations, the rooms on the east side were found intact, together with a fountain, pools, a grotto, and a large nymphaeum adorned with statues and reliefs. The decoration of the house reflects a high degree of refinement and exquisite taste. Frescoes were also found on the lower walls depicting mythological subjects and elegant floral decorations. Of particular note are the remains of a large system of hypocausts. The frigidarium, the cold bath, had 5 square marble basins arranged in 2 rows. Each basin had its own furnace, a small raised platform, and a drain hole. They were probably used for washing the body before immersion in warmer water. The tepidarium was a room with a floor plan similar to that of a Greek cross. Here a continuous series of fresco decorations depicted nymphs, cupids, and tritons among marine plants and